Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back. It is now time for slideshow about federalism. This is Federalism Part 2. It will be shorter than the last one, only 3 slides with information on it. But the reading, so the case reading and questions will be longer today. So you'll have that to do today and then this weekend. So let's start where we left off. We talked about the expansion of the national government with the idea of using the implied powers doctrine. So that was dealt with McCulloch versus Maryland. And then supremacy was also dealt with that, but there's more aspects to supremacy. This time we're going to talk about supremacy in the Commerce Clause. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, it's the clause that allows Congress to regulate interstate, international commerce, and that with the Indian tribes. It is, in this case, it is an enumerated power. So Commerce Clause is not implied at the beginning here. It is enumerated with those 3 things. Those 3 things seem to be fairly straightforward, but where we really have the issues here is what actually is meant by interstate commerce. So there is a case here. This is not our one of our 15, but it is a case you just need to understand a little bit because it's kind of the first start of using the Commerce Clause. It's called Gibbons versus Ogden. And in the end, the case was about, and I always forget which one was which, but one of these guys had a ferry service that he was allowed by the state of New York to have a monopoly on using a ferry service for people and cargo across the Hudson River to New Jersey. Well, the other guy had a ferry service based in New Jersey, and he wanted to also be a ferry service from New Jersey to New York and back. Well, the state of New York said he couldn't do that because the state of New York said they could regulate who was doing this particular thing. Well, the Supreme Court said, it finally went there, the Supreme Court said that since Congress is the one that can regulate interstate commerce, this clearly is interstate commerce because it's commerce between New York and New Jersey, that Congress can regulate it and not the states. So it was really the first idea set out by the Supreme Court starting to define what interstate commerce was. And this one seems pretty obvious. Yes, it is. It's across the river, state to state. That's interstate. It's going to get a little bit more muddy. What this started to do was create this broader definition of what interstate meant, and now it's almost become an implied power because it's the most used clause by Congress to justify what they do. Congress almost all the time will put in their bill, they'll put where in the Constitution they get their authority from. And the one they use the most is the Interstate Commerce Clause. And we'll see how that will change. Early Congresses used the power to regulate commerce. More recently, Congress uses the power to stimulate commerce, to move commerce ahead. Okay, so that gets us to moving forward. The commerce power was used more and more and more after the Civil War, through the Great Depression, and into the Civil Rights era. And we'll start with the Civil War here on expansion, and it starts with an attempt to limit the national government. If you remember from your American history, hopefully, last year, remember nullification and the nullification crisis. As early as prior to 1800, some respected founders and framers actually started thinking that nullification was a good idea. Even Jefferson and Madison, and remember, Madison's the primary author of the Constitution. They started to advocate, because they thought the government was getting too large, to advocate for the state's ability to declare a national law unconstitutional. That's where we get the word nullification, to nullify a state law. And it was something that was bandied about for a while. It never really took effect until we get closer to the Civil War. And that caused, if you remember, in the early 1830s, the nullification crisis led by John C. Calhoun. So that really started, and it was the southern states who were starting to say no, and it was about slavery more than anything else, that you can't tell us that we can't, that we don't regulate slavery ourselves and that kind of thing. And it will, of course, lead to the Civil War, and it's going to be settled by that. The idea of nullification is essentially settled by the Civil War. So it's settled by a war. And really what it did was militarily back up what McCulloch said. McCulloch, remember, is supremacy in this case. We're talking about, so the idea of supremacy. It settled the idea of which sphere was dominant. If state law, of course, if state law and federal law conflicted, which sphere had the power. And that's what it did. So it's the Civil War, among other things, is a military settlement of the idea of McCulloch. Okay, so lastly then, the idea of racial equality was also used to expand, and what we're talking about here is the Brown versus Board decision and those that followed. Now, Brown versus Board is one of our cases, but we're going to do it in Unit 3 where it fits in the civil rights portion of Unit 3. But we have to understand that that decision and the rulings that followed about desegregation and a variety of other issues established the supremacy of the national government. They used the Commerce Clause to say that they could regulate desegregation and they could regulate hotel and other services as far as segregation goes by saying it belonged in interstate commerce. So that's the last sort of big expansion. Since then, since the Supreme Court began to limit this stuff, it happened in the last 3 decades or so, starting in the very late 1980s into the 1990s, and that's where we get our case. In fact, there's 2 cases that you'll deal with today. Our case that's on our list of 15 is the Lopez case, U.S. versus Lopez. But in addition, there's another case from 2000 that sort of helps us reiterate the Lopez idea. And those 2 cases are the 2 cases you'll have your homework assignment for. So that's all we're going to say about them here, and you'll get that together when you do your assignment. You'll start to understand that. The last thing to mention here is recently, and it's sort of another expansion of power. It was the Affordable Care Act, or what's commonly known as Obamacare. And it involves, the case is actually called the Sebelius case, National Federation of Business versus Sebelius. Kathleen Sebelius was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which was where Obamacare was run from. The reason this case is in here is because it popped up on an exam about 3 years ago, and we had not ever taught it. So all of us teachers, once we heard about that question, we were really upset that they asked a question about the Sebelius case when they didn't tell us that that's something that you guys needed to know. So hopefully you now know this. Well, you do now know this, and maybe if there's a question, you'll be able to answer it. But this was the idea that the Supreme Court ruled that the individual mandate, which was part of Obamacare, which forced people to purchase health insurance, was within the power of the national government by saying it was a tax. And that had never been argued. The government wanted to make sure that nobody thought it was a tax. They didn't argue it was a tax because people don't like taxes. So they called it a penalty instead. Well, the Supreme Court decided, well, you might call it a penalty, but we're going to call it a tax, so it's cool. It's okay. Conservatives hated that decision. Liberals loved that decision. But that is what that case was about. So that's all for today. Your assignment, your homework assignment is more substantial because there's more reading to it. So I'll post that here shortly. But this is the end of our notes today. So one more session before the test. Have a good one. We'll see you later.